A Tale of Two Canadas, Quebec and Ontario's History. G'day guys, how's it going? My name is AussieTash. I love learning about Canada. I love these history videos. Really looking forward to this. It was made about 2 years ago. Not quite too sure what it's about. Let's get into it and let's find out some history about Canada, focusing on Quebec and Ontario. Let's go.
When France and Great Britain decided to outsource their rivalry to another continent, they established new colonies whilst they were there too, bringing profit to their respective crowns, yes, but glory even more so. France got there first and established colonies along the St. Lawrence River and into the US interior. Whilst this interior was sparsely populated, Quebec City became a major settlement in the New World. England and later Great Britain got there a little later, but with bigger stick diplomacy they expanded across the 13 colonies and in the Hudson Bay too. The pair coexisted in the east, but they didn't coexist peacefully. Four major wars broke out between the French and British over control of the New World, and during the 7 Years' War, their Ohio Valley squabbling had ballooned into a major global conflict. France lost and ceded all of its territories in North America to Britain and Spain. But things were far from cooling down. During the peace negotiations, the French colony of Canada was ceded to Britain, but the question of Quebec arose. Being the first properly established French colony, it had a high concentration of French peoples who were slightly worried of being deported. With every Quebec question came a Quebec compromise, and so a secret backdoor deal brewed between the British and the French Quebecois to give them land, some autonomy, and freedom of religion and expression of their French culture.
Yes.
The Quebec Act, as it was known, made the American colonists down south furious. The Americans had far less freedom than the Quebecois, and also hated Catholics, especially French ones.
Oh my gosh, war these days, it's all about religion. Think about all the stuff that's happening in Lebanon and Israel. Yes, they're fighting over land, but it's all about religion. Man, I love this Quebec Act. I don't know much about it, but it peed off the Yanks, it peed off the Americans, and that's really cool because they were trying to just take over everything, weren't they? And they have this delusion that, they saved the war from World War II. They saved the entire war from World War II. They were one of the last countries to even enter World War II. And why did that happen? Because of Pearl Harbor. Otherwise, maybe they wouldn't have even participated in World War II.
The special treatment of Quebec became a scandal and only further increased anti-British sentiment in the 13 colonies ahead of the Revolution. But why on earth would the most anti-French power in the world let the French exist in their own empire?
There's a lot of French
Canada
history
has
there.
really terrible geography. Although the country has fertile prairies, metal-rich veins, wide rivers and a large basin of natural gas, unlike America, none of Canada's geographical features overlap, and the Canadian Rockies and Shield have no natural gaps to allow trade to pass through easily.
No,
There is no interior river to export food to the coasts. Canada's natural gas is stuck in between mountains, and Canada's untapped metal deposits are in the Arctic. Canada has one major waterway, the St. Lawrence. It's fantastic for shipping, and its river basin is large enough to support population centres, but the river only goes up to the Great Lakes, and by the time it passes Quebec City, it widens so much that it effectively becomes a bay. This basin is surrounded on all sides by water, mountains, or the Canadian Shield. At this point in time, the British controlled the Hudson Bay and maritime Canada, and thanks to the aforementioned water, mountains and Canadian Shield, the path to get to Quebec from British Canada was through mountainous land or stormy sea, or sometimes both.
Hold on. So at this point in time, the British, they had full control of the Hudson Bay area. Wow, that's crazy. I know there was a lot of wars in Canada. The French, they tried to invade Canada. They lost. The British, they tried to invade Canada. They lost because, man, didn't Canada put up a fight? The Americans, they tried to invade Canada. Canada, they say they burnt down the original White House in America. I think it was the English, but yes, Canada played their part in burning down the original White House. But yeah, Canada have fought some fierce wars defending their country from other land. But it looks like there was some 7-year war. I have learnt a little bit about it, but I think I'm going to have to do some videos focusing on the 7-year war. Guys, in the comments, Give me some suggestions, some YouTube suggestions, or join us on Discord and throwing some suggestions on Discord. Guys, we have a great time chatting on Discord. I've got some friends in Quebec. I've got some friends in Ontario. I've got some friends in British Columbia, Nova Scotia. Man, I'm pretty much Dawson City. I've got friends that I speak to on Discord in all provinces and territories from Canada. So guys, please jump on. We have a great time.
The route was far from favourable. If an uprising were to occur in Quebec, by the time the cavalry arrived from Blighty, the Quebecois would have long seized control. To understand fully why Quebec did survive British colonisation, we need to look at an older example, Acadia. The French maritime province turned British wouldn't get the same treatment as Quebec. The Acadians were given 1 year to declare their allegiance to the British, or else be deported. Why weren't the French in Quebec deported? Very simple explanation. Acadia's French population when the deportation process began was 9,000. Quebec's population after being handed over to Britain was 70,000. Deporting about 70,000 French would have been a logistical task not available in the 18th century.
No, absolutely not.
This isn't even to mention the fact that the average Quebecois had 11 children. So like a hole that only ever gets deeper, there was no point for the British to even try and dig itself out.
Never gonna happen, mate. Yeah, no. Imagine
Britain
trying
won
to
the 7 Years'
70,000
War
people,
against France,
deport them.
and although it was this war that helped them gain Quebec, it was this very same war that paradoxically prevented them from being able to afford keeping Quebec. Britain was £60 million in debt and could not afford a Quebec rebellion, so tried as hard as they could to keep them as happy as possible by making them pay very little tax, and instead taxed America and maritime Canada vigorously.
So basically it come down to money. They couldn't afford to try and invade Quebec, and they could not afford to send back 70,000+ people to France. So yeah. So things were looking a little bit better for the people of Quebec back at this time.
America especially didn't take kindly to the taxes. It was Quebec's special treatment, social and economic, that would set America on the path for revolution. One American Revolutionary War later, and it was obvious. Britain had made a severe misjudgment. Out of fear of a French uprising, they had lost their most valuable colony, and with it, a large portion of income. They were now in even more debt, and also had thousands of British loyalists emigrating into Canada, in southwestern Quebec, what would later become Ontario. Why didn't Quebec tag along with America then? Simply, they would be trading hands between the British, who they didn't like but granted them land and freedom, and the Americans, who hated French Catholics. So Quebec, with no backdoor option, remained the French sheep in the British flock.
They had no choice, did they? Okay, so yeah, who do you want to make a deal with? The Americans, who clearly don't like your religion. And that is, man, war is all about religion. It's really, really sad. I'm not going to turn this into some sort of religious thing, but just have a look at what's going on in the world at the moment. It is horrible. Australia, we have heaps of planes. We've been chartering heaps of planes to get as many people out of Israel and Lebanon as we can to come back here. But yeah, man, it is just really, really sad. The Americans, they didn't get their way. You know, the people from Quebec, they had to side with the English, with the English settlement. You know, they weren't happy about that, but man, it's better than siding with the Americans. That just wouldn't have worked out at all for them. Okay, 2 Canadas. Let's go.
After the American Revolutionary War, many British loyalists emigrated from the US to Canada on the lowlands of the Great Lakes, in Quebecois territory. This area, along with New Brunswick and Nova Scotia, became the relocating areas for British loyalists fleeing from America to help anglicize the region. Despite Quebec now being part of Canada officially, there was a general mistrust between Quebec and British Canada. So these immigrants played a vital role in geopolitics, which was effectively to trap Quebec in the St. Lawrence Basin to prevent expansion of French culture in Canada, in hopes that it would die off over time.
Well, that didn't happen.
They were. The British settlers in Quebec became a little unhappy being told what to do by the stinky French. So with every Quebec question came a Quebec compromise. The old province of Quebec was carved into 2. Upper Canada, on the Great Lake lowlands, heavily populated by British settlers, would become independent, whilst further downstream became Lower Canada, or French Canada. One war of 1812 later, and Canada fell under the rule of the Family Compact, a pro-British corrupt cabal. In 1837, rebellions would break out against the tyrannical colonial governors. This was not just a rebellion. This was a message to the British that Canada wasn't just another outpost in God nowhere, but it was beginning to congeal into its own distinct identity. Canadians now wanted to rule themselves, and a few years later this coalesced in the Act of Union, and a few years after that, the British North America Act. Canada would unite into a confederation, and become a dominion of the British Empire, and Blighty from 67 onwards governed very little of Canada's local issues, and only had direct say over Canada's foreign policy. Instead of in London, Canada would be governed from Ottawa, Quebec City, and Toronto.
Okay. So, the royal family, or the British, the English, they had no power over what happens in Canada at this time. That's really cool. Obviously, like Canada and Australia, we're under the Commonwealth, but, you know, King Charles, he doesn't have a say in what happens here. He's just the face of our money, pretty much. That's about it. He's got no say in what happens here in Australia, and I'm pretty sure he doesn't really have much say in how Canada is governed either. So, yeah, like I said, they just say cheese, and then they have their picture printed on our money. That's about it. Ontario.
The English-speaking Ontario's population more than doubled in the first 10 years of the Act of Union, and the Anglophone West surpassed the Francophone East for the first time. Ottawa itself was a symbol of Canada's countless compromises. It sits on the Ottawa River at the midpoint between Toronto and Quebec City, the central point of British and French populations. As Canada itself began to take shape, focus turned away from the squabbling in the east to the expansion in the west. Vancouver, Columbia, and the Klondike Gold Rush became focal points of the late 19th century. In Ontario, Quebec, and the Maritimes, 1 million Canadians left for America, who after their Civil War saw a massive boom in industry, but things in Canada were improving. Ontario would emerge as the financial capital of this new Canada, a big trading hub in North America, and it would become extremely wealthy. As the decades went on, the increasingly struggling maritime provinces and the growing eastern ones turned to Ontario as the leader of this new Canada.
So I'm just looking where Ontario is located on the map. Ottawa is the capital of Canada, and it's located in Ontario. And look where Ontario is. It's right in the middle of those three provinces. So yeah, that makes sense. A great location. Quebec, mate, they must have heaps of money. And what do they call them? Francophones? Quebec, they produce what? 75% of the world's maple syrup. So yeah, there's got to be some money coming out there. I understand they love their French. They're very, very strong and passionate about speaking French. There is some rule that has, or some bill that has been passed, you know, really, really invoking that everybody speaks French. Don't want to get too political. I did do a video on that. Mate, I had it up for about 3 hours and then I pulled the plug because there was so much fighting on and it was only up for about 3 hours. So, yeah. There was some passionate comments from people from Quebec and some nasty comments from other people from in other provinces and territories in Canada. So, yeah, I took it down, mate.
At the Somme, in Calais, and in the skies over Belgium, Canadians found their own identity. Much like the Australian revelation at Gallipoli, the Canadian found that they could not rely on the British, but instead on their fellow Canadian. Hundreds of thousands were conscripted into a Europeans' war. 67,000 wouldn't make it home. But their death wasn't in vain, as Canada was catapulted onto the world stage after the war. They received a seat at the Paris Peace Conference, but in stereotypical Canadian fashion, they demanded nothing from the defeated empires. At home, though, the divide between Ontario and Quebec was only more obvious to see. Whilst British Canadians signed up to fight in droves, French Canadians saw no loyalty to Britain or to France. New laws of conscription stirred up opposition in Quebec City. Opposition became protests. Protests became riots, and on Easter Monday, soldiers occupied the city and were ordered to fire on the crowds.
What? Hold on. Is this real? This really happened? Oh my gosh. When did you say this happened? That's terrible. So there was some full-on real fighting between Quebec and Ontario. That's crazy. Man, the only real civil war we've had here in Australia is against the emus, and they beat us. Yes, I said emus as in an animal, and they beat us. They were terrorizing farmers, and we tried to eradicate the population of emus. We even asked for like things to blow them up and stuff like that, but they said, no, you can't do that. So, yeah. And now the emu population in Australia, it's absolutely crazy. But yeah, we haven't really had a civil war here in Australia. We come here in the First Fleet, as British, as prisoners. The Aboriginals, of course, they were here on the land first. The Aboriginal elders, they've been here for like 50, 60,000 years. So, of course, there's horrible, horrible stories of when the white Europeans settled in Australia, they took on the Aboriginals as slaves and all that sort of stuff. But yeah, I don't really think we've actually had a civil war here in Australia. I could be wrong, but I'm not quite too sure.
This was the bloodiest day of what became known as the Easter Riots.
The Easter
5
Riots.
people died in one day, and almost 100 were injured.
Oh my
Quebecois
gosh.
insurrection would die down for about half a century.
Oh my gosh.
The 60s saw a shift in Quebec around a new ideal of a secular, modern, but independent Quebec.
Yeah,
Although
okay.
the Quiet Revolution saw the Catholic Church moderated, more extremist forms of Quebecois nationalism would emerge. Front de Libération du Québec, a separatist terrorist group, would cause significant havoc from 1963 to 70, such as bombing the Montreal Stock Exchange, blowing up mailboxes, and kidnapping and then murdering a certain Pierre Laporte.
What? This is like IRA sort of stuff, man. This is a bit crazy. But it's a part of their history, man. It's a part of Quebec and Ontario's history. So, yeah.
Tide of nationalism eventually coalesced into two historic votes. Do you want Quebec to be independent? Was the question. Which very nearly passed, which thank God for both Ontario and Quebec, as neither side had a well-thought-through plan for how Quebec would gain independence. Now why does that sound familiar? The truth is, Quebec is much better being a part of Canada. Quebec doesn't actually make enough money to sustain itself, and after leaving Canada, Quebec would still need to pay for its own immigration and customs, its own rail network, its own national debt, and the Aboriginals in the north who threatened to leave Quebec and rejoin Canada. What Quebec really wants is to have all the benefits of being in Canada whilst not being a part of Canada. And really, they already have that. Quebec, despite its flamboyant French separatism and its divide with Ottawa, is still so dependent on Ontario. The equalisation payment scheme introduced in the 50s was to help move money from the richer areas of Canada to the poorer areas, notably Quebec, who last year received more than $13 billion from this scheme, and also more than any other province by quite some margin. Quebec has become so reliant on these payments that it's become ingrained into the province's finances. Without these payments, they would be bankrupt in a generation. Any serious Quebecois politician knows that staying in Canada is the best choice forward for Quebec, whose aging demography will only make them furthermore reliant on Ontario, and more so, Alberta. But more on that one day soon. Ontario and Quebec are one hell of a story. From French colonisation to British emigration to rebellious desperation to forging a confederation to building a nation and Quebecois separation. Ontario and Quebec's importance in Canada will diminish over the next decades, but the history of these very different yet connected sister provinces will be a continuing story for generations to come.
I have lots of questions, guys, so you're going to have to give me the answers. What are your thoughts on the history of Quebec and Ontario? I know that people from Quebec are very, very passionate. They love their French, they love their history, but yeah, I really don't know. Should they become independent? I'm not quite too sure. Mate, to me, it sounds like, except for the actual wars, Quebec and Ottawa fight like Queensland and New South Wales. And the way we sort it out every year is by playing 3 games of football on a football field and smashing the crap out of each other. So maybe you guys should do that. YouTube State of Origin 2023 and see what New South Wales and Queensland do to each other. They just beat the crap out of each other, guys. I am a huge New South Wales fan. It went pear-shaped for us this year. Pear-shaped big time. But yeah, every year we get on the footy field and we just fight to sort out all this stuff. So to me, that's my advice. Quebec and Ontario, play a State of Origin series. All right, that was the video for today, guys. If you liked it, please jump on, smash the like button, leave a comment, and please remember to subscribe. That really helps me out. Guys, in the comments, please share them. Don't be too political and don't be too nasty. Cheers to that under. Take care. Bye.